Today is Monday, June 8th, 2026, and today is National Jelly-Filled Doughnut Day, which is one of those holidays that sounds like it was created by somebody looking at a perfectly good donut and deciding it needed more commitment. Not just dough, not just sugar, a surprise center. And oddly enough, that connects to today's stories better than I expected, because all three of today's stories involve ideas that turned out to have much longer lives than anyone probably imagined at the time. A set of constitutional protections, a novel about a frightening future, and a lasagna-loving cat that somehow refuses to leave popular culture. Welcome to Wait, That's Random, This Day in History. I'm C.L. Burns, voice actor, audiobook narrator, and a person who keeps discovering that history is somehow both fascinating and deeply concerning at the same time. On June 8, 1789, James Madison stood before Congress and introduced a series of proposed amendments to the Constitution. At the time, they weren't called the Bill of Rights. They were simply proposed changes. And honestly, that's one of the things I find most fascinating about history. People living through important moments almost never know which moments future generations will memorize. To many Americans in 1789, the Constitution itself was still new. The country was still figuring out what kind of government it wanted to be. Some people worried the federal government would become too powerful. Others worried the country was too fragile to survive. There were passionate arguments in newspapers, public meetings, taverns, and state legislatures. One of the biggest concerns was simple. What protections do ordinary citizens have if government power grows too large? Madison's answer was to propose amendments protecting specific rights: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, the right to assemble, protection against unreasonable searches, and several others. What I found interesting while reading about this period is that Madison had not originally been the loudest advocate for a Bill of Rights. He came to see that adding explicit protections could help unify a deeply divided country. And the debates were incredibly detailed. People argued over wording, definitions, intent, what specific phrases should mean. In other words, they sounded a lot like people arguing on the internet today, only with fewer memes. Eventually, 10 amendments were ratified and became the Bill of Rights. And more than 2 centuries later, people still debate them constantly, which means a discussion that began in 1789 never really ended. And speaking of ideas that lingered for generations, June 8th also gave us one of the most influential warnings ever printed. On June 8th, 1949, 1984 by George Orwell was published. And it's difficult to think of another novel that contributed so many phrases to everyday conversation. Big Brother, thought police, doublethink, newspeak. Even people who have never read the book often recognize the references. The story follows Winston Smith, a man living in a society where the government monitors nearly every aspect of life. History is rewritten. Language is manipulated. Information is controlled. Reality itself becomes negotiable. And what fascinates me most is that Orwell wasn't trying to predict a specific future. He was exploring a fear. The fear that truth could become something controlled by power. One detail that stood out to me while revisiting the book's history is how quickly readers recognized its relevance. Reviews were intense. Political groups argued over its meaning. People interpreted it through the lens of their own governments and societies. And that never really stopped. Decades later, whenever new surveillance technology appears, people mention Orwell. Whenever governments collect information, people mention Orwell. Whenever someone worries about manipulation of language or information, people mention Orwell. Very few books manage to become part of everyday vocabulary. Most novels are read, and a handful are remembered. But 1984 became something different. It became shorthand. A cultural reference point people still reach for nearly 80 years later. That's a remarkable level of staying power for a story that began as one man's warning. And then sometimes an idea survives not because it's profound or political, but because it's funny. On June 8, 1978, the first Garfield comic strip appeared in newspapers. And honestly, if you had told newspaper editors in 1978 that this orange cat would still be culturally relevant nearly 50 years later, they probably would have laughed. Garfield was created by cartoonist Jim Davis. The premise was simple: a sarcastic cat, an oblivious owner, a long-suffering dog, and an endless supply of jokes about food, naps, and avoiding effort. But simplicity turned out to be part of the magic, because Garfield's personality was instantly recognizable. He loved lasagna, hated Mondays, avoided exercise whenever possible, and felt deeply offended whenever anyone expected him to accomplish anything. Which, if we're being honest, is a mood many people understand. The comic exploded in popularity. Soon there were books, merchandise, movies, video games, stuffed animals, coffee mugs, calendars. Probably several thousand products nobody expected to exist. One detail I love is that Garfield became so popular that old Garfield-themed suction cup toys appeared in car windows all over America during the 1980s. For a while, it seemed impossible to drive anywhere without spotting one. And somehow, Garfield never completely disappeared. New generations kept discovering him. The comic continued. Animated adaptations continued. Internet culture embraced him in strange ways. Today, nearly 50 years after his debut, people still know exactly who Garfield is, which is kind of amazing. Entire television shows have come and gone. Fads have appeared and vanished. Technologies have become obsolete. And somehow, the lazy orange cat remains. Maybe that's because some ideas connect with people at a very basic level. Everyone knows somebody who complains about Mondays, even if that somebody is occasionally themselves. And after spending today's episode around ideas that lasted far longer than anyone expected, it feels fitting to end with someone whose work still shapes the world around us every day. Born on June 8, 1867 in Wisconsin, Frank Lloyd Wright became one of the most influential architects in modern history. And what made Wright unusual wasn't simply that he designed beautiful buildings. It was that he challenged assumptions about what buildings should be. Before Wright, many architects treated structures almost like isolated objects. Wright wanted buildings to feel connected to their surroundings, to fit into the landscape, to work with nature instead of competing against it. His homes often featured open floor plans long before that became common. Natural lighting, flowing interior spaces, design ideas that still influence houses today. One thing I kept noticing while reading about him was how many concepts people now consider normal were once viewed as unusual, which is often how innovation works. At first it looks strange. Then it looks familiar. Then eventually people forgot it was ever new. Something I kept circling back to while working through June 8th was how difficult it is to predict which ideas will survive. Some disappear almost immediately. Others somehow keep finding new audiences decade after decade. A constitutional amendment, a dystopian novel, a comic strip cat. Very different creations, yet all three managed to outlive the moment that produced them. Anyway, that was where June 8th eventually led me. And before I disappear for the day, here's a quote that felt strangely connected to all of it. The ideas that have lightened my way have been kindness, beauty, and truth. Albert Einstein. If you'd like to hear more of my narration work, podcasts, or other projects, you can find everything at waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns, and thanks for taking a weird little walk through history with me. I'll see you tomorrow.